Emily Carter's seemingly perfect life shatters when she uncovers her husband Mark's affair with his project manager. Lauren's betrayal deepens as Mark's lies and manipulations escalate, leading to a bitter battle over trust, reputation, and control. As Emily fights to reclaim her life, the shocking lengths Mark goes to maintain power fuel tension and outrage. The story unveils the devastating emotional toll of infidelity, the fallout from selfish decisions, and the resilience required to confront betrayal head-on, leaving viewers gripped by the controversial twists and moral complexities of broken trust and retribution. Our story takes place in Charleston, South Carolina, in the fall of 2018. It's the kind of town where every house has a wraparound porch, and gossip spreads faster than wildfire. Emily Carter, a 35-year-old interior designer, has a talent for turning drab spaces into stunning works of art. She's warm, ambitious, and always puts others before herself, which, as you'll see, becomes both her strength and her downfall. Emily has been married to Mark Carter, her high school sweetheart, for 12 years. On the surface, they're the perfect couple. The house with the white picket fence, 2 golden retrievers, and a love story straight out of a Hallmark movie. Mark, a 37-year-old civil engineer, is charming and sociable, the kind of guy who can fix a sink one minute and win over a room full of strangers the next. But appearances can be deceiving. It all begins on a crisp October morning. Emily is in her kitchen, wearing an oversized sweater and sipping her second cup of coffee. Her best friend Claire bursts in, uninvited as always, holding 2 pumpkin spice lattes and enough gossip to fuel a week. "Morning, sunshine," Claire chirps, dropping her bag on the counter. "You're not going to believe what I heard at yoga today." Claire is the quintessential Southern best friend, bold, nosy, but fiercely loyal. If there's one thing she loves more than Emily, it's knowing everything about everyone. Emily rolls her eyes but smiles. What is it this time? Did Sandra finally decide to divorce Rick? Better Mark was spotted having lunch with a woman at the Marina Cafe yesterday, and before you say it was probably work-related, they didn't exactly look like they were discussing blueprints. Emily freezes mid-sip. Her first instinct is to laugh it off. Mark's always been friendly, maybe too friendly, but never unfaithful. "Claire, please, Mark's not the type. He barely has time to grab lunch between projects." Claire raises an eyebrow. "Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. You should ask him about it." Emily brushes it off, but the seed of doubt has been planted. She tries to push the thought away, convincing herself Claire has a tendency to jump to conclusions. As the day goes on, the idea lingers. That evening, Mark comes home later than usual, claiming he got caught up at the office. He kisses Emily on the cheek and heads straight for the shower, avoiding the usual small talk. Emily notices something feels off. It's not anything she can put her finger on, just a vibe. She brushes it off as exhaustion. After all, they've both been busy. Emily with a big project for a new client and Mark with a high-profile infrastructure deal. The next day, Emily's curiosity gets the better of her. During her lunch break, she decides to stop by Mark's office. It's not something she normally does, but she was in the area. When she walks in, the receptionist greets her warmly, but there's a flicker of surprise in her expression. "Hi, Mrs. Carter. Mark just stepped out for lunch. Should be back in about an hour." "Lunch?" Emily echoes, her stomach tightening. "Did he mention who he was meeting?" The receptionist hesitates. I think he said it was with a client. I'm not sure." Emily forces a smile and thanks her before leaving. As she sits in her car, a wave of unease washes over her. Mark rarely mentioned lunch meetings, and when he did, he was usually upfront about them. Something doesn't add up. Later that night, as they sit down for dinner, Emily decides to test the waters. "So, how was work today?" "Busy as usual?" Mark nods, barely looking up from his plate. "Yeah, same old stuff. You know how it is." "Any interesting clients lately?" she presses, keeping her tone casual. He pauses for a split second, just long enough for her to notice, before responding. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason, just curious." The conversation moves on, but Emily can't shake the feeling he's hiding something. That night, after Mark falls asleep, She does something she never thought she'd do. She takes his phone from the nightstand and unlocks it using the passcode she's known for years but never had a reason to use. Her hands tremble as she scrolls through his messages, emails, and call logs. At first, there's nothing unusual, until she notices a string of texts from a contact saved as LC. The messages are vague but suggestive. Had a great time yesterday, let's do it again soon. Me too, next week works for me. Can't wait, you're worth the risk. Emily's heart pounds in her chest. She screenshots the messages and forwards them to her own phone before putting Mark's back exactly where she found it. She lies awake for hours, her mind racing with questions. Who is LC? How long has this been going on? And what does worth the risk even mean? By morning, Emily decides she needs answers. She doesn't confront Mark directly, at least not yet. Instead, she enlists the help of Claire, who immediately springs into action like a detective in a true crime documentary. "We'll figure this out," Claire assures her, poring over the screenshots. "But first, we need to know who LC is. My guess, it's probably someone he works with." Over the next few days, Emily starts piecing things together. She notices little changes in Mark's behavior, how he's more protective of his phone, how he leaves the room to take certain calls, how he suddenly seems more invested in his appearance. It's like she's seeing him through a different lens, one that reveals cracks she hadn't noticed before. And then, a breakthrough. Claire calls Emily late one night, practically screaming into the phone. "I found her. LC is Lauren Chambers, and you're not gonna believe this. She's his project manager. They've been working together for months." Emily feels like the wind has been knocked out of her Lauren Chambers, a name that sounds too polished, too perfect. She pulls up Lauren's LinkedIn profile and is greeted by a photo of a stunning blonde with a dazzling smile and a list of accomplishments. A mile long, Emily's mind races with possibilities, but one thought stands out above the rest. How could he do this to me? Emily stared at Lauren's profile, her mind spinning with questions. Lauren Chambers wasn't just attractive. She was polished and confident, the type of woman who turned heads wherever she went. Emily's insecurities started bubbling up. Was it her fault? Had she been so wrapped up in her work that she'd neglected her marriage? Or was this just who Mark was all along? The next day, Emily couldn't focus on anything. Her usually meticulous design sketches were a mess, and even Claire noticed how distracted she was during their morning coffee. "You need to confront him, Em," Claire said firmly. "You can't keep driving yourself crazy over this." Emily shook her head. "I can't. Not yet. I need to know the truth first. Everything. If I confront him now, he'll just deny it or twist things around." Claire sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she whipped out her phone. "All right, then. It's time to take this investigation up a notch. I know a guy." Emily blinked. "You know a guy?" Claire smirked. "Oh, honey, I know everyone you want answers. Let me handle it." Reluctantly, Emily agreed. By the end of the day, Claire had arranged for a private investigator, some guy named Joe who specialized in domestic concerns, as Claire put it. Joe assured Emily he'd be discreet, but his voice carried a tone of confidence that made her feel both reassured and anxious. Over the next week, Emily tried to act normal, but it wasn't easy. Every time Mark kissed her goodbye or sat next to her on the couch, she couldn't help but wonder where his mind was or who he was texting. He seemed distracted, and his excuses for working late were becoming more frequent. One night, as Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Joe. "Got something? Can we meet tomorrow?" Her stomach sank. The next morning, Emily met Joe in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. He slid a folder across the table without saying a word. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were several photos. Mark and Lauren sitting at a restaurant, their heads close together. Mark leaving the office and getting into Lauren's car. Lauren reaching over and touching his hand as they sat in a parked car. Emily's throat tightened as she flipped through the photos. There was no denying it now. The way Mark looked at Lauren wasn't professional. It was intimate. Joe cleared his throat. "I followed them for a few days. They're careful, but not careful enough. There's more if you want me to keep digging." Emily closed the folder and shook her head. "No, this is enough." She left the coffee shop feeling numb. Her mind raced with anger, hurt, and disbelief. How could Mark do this after everything they'd built together? But as the initial wave of emotions subsided, a new thought took over. What was she going to do about it? At home, Emily sat in the kitchen with a glass of wine. Staring at the folder, Claire's voice echoed in her head. "You need to confront him." But confronting him felt too simple, too easy. She wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal before she said anything. So, she waited. Mark didn't suspect a thing. He went about his routine as if nothing was wrong, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was now watching his every move. Emily started noticing patterns. How his mood improved on the days he worked late. How he always seemed to check his phone before leaving the house. How he had started wearing cologne more often. Meanwhile, Emily did her own digging. She started paying closer attention to their finances, looking for anything unusual. Sure enough, there were charges she didn't recognize. Expensive dinners, boutique shops she'd never heard of, even a hotel reservation under Mark's name from 2 weeks ago. The evidence was overwhelming, but Emily still wasn't ready to confront him. Instead, she started planning her next move. If Mark thought he could keep lying to her, he was in for a rude awakening. One evening, while Mark was in the shower, Emily sat at the kitchen table with Claire, going over her plan. "You're sure about this?" Claire asked, her voice laced with concern. Emily nodded. "I've been quiet for too long. It's time for him to see what it feels like to be blindsided." Over the next week, Emily started laying the groundwork. She contacted a lawyer to discuss her options, began gathering all the evidence she had, and even reached out to Lauren's boss anonymously, hinting at the inappropriate relationship she'd uncovered. She wasn't just going to confront Mark, she was going to dismantle the fantasy he'd built piece by piece. When the day finally came, Emily was ready. Mark came home late, as usual, looking tired but pleased with himself. He kissed her on the cheek and sat down at the table. "How was your day?" he asked casually, scrolling through his phone. Emily smiled sweetly. "Oh, it was fine. Actually, I was thinking we could talk about something." Mark glanced up, a flicker of nervousness crossing his face. "Sure. What's up?" Emily slid the folder across the table. "This." Mark froze slowly. He picked up the folder and opened it. His face paled as he flipped through the photos. "Emily, Don't," she interrupted, her voice cold. "Don't insult me by lying." Mark closed the folder, his hands trembling. "It's not what it looks like." Emily laughed bitterly. "Really? Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with your project manager while pretending to be the perfect husband." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Emily cut him off again. "Do you even realize what you've done? You've not only betrayed me, but you've embarrassed me, humiliated me. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" He stammered. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Emily held up a hand. "Save it. I don't care about your excuses. I've already spoken to a lawyer I know about the money you've spent on her, the lies you've told. It's over, Mark." Mark's face crumpled, but Emily didn't give him the chance to plead. She stood up, her voice steady. "You can stay in the guest room tonight tomorrow. You can pack your things and leave." As she walked away, Emily felt a mix of emotions. Pain, anger, and, most surprisingly, relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was in control again. Now, before we move forward, don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories, like this one. We appreciate your support. It helps us keep bringing you these incredible tales. Mark spent the night in the guest room, though Emily doubted he slept much. She could hear him pacing back and forth until the early hours of the morning. Meanwhile, she lay awake in their bed, replaying everything in her mind. The betrayal, the lies, the audacity. It was all too much. But despite the pain, Emily felt a new sense of clarity. She wasn't just a victim of Mark's choices. She was in control now. The next morning, Emily was already in the kitchen when Mark emerged, looking disheveled. He hesitated in the doorway, clearly unsure of what to say. "Good morning," she said coolly, sipping her coffee. "Emily, we need to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk?" She raised an eyebrow, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Funny, you didn't feel the need to talk before sneaking around with Lauren." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I made a mistake. A huge mistake, but it didn't mean anything." "Stop," she interrupted. "Just stop. Do you think I'm stupid that I'll believe this was just some meaningless fling? You don't accidentally have an affair, Mark. You made choices over and over again." He opened his mouth to argue, but Emily didn't give him the chance. "I've already packed some of your things. You'll find them by the door. I think it's best if you leave for a while." Mark's face crumpled. "Emily, please, don't do this. I love you." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Love, is that what you call this? Don't insult me, Mark. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but the weight of his guilt seemed to crush him. Without another word, he turned and left the room. Moments later, Emily heard the front door close. For the first time in days, the house was quiet. But Emily knew this was far from over. Later that day, Emily met with her lawyer to discuss the next steps. The lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Karen, didn't sugarcoat anything. "You have a solid case," Karen said, flipping through the evidence Emily had gathered. "The photos, the financial records, it's all damning. But you need to prepare yourself. If this goes to court, it could get messy." Emily nodded. "I'm ready for that. I just want to make sure he doesn't get away with this." Karen smiled. "Trust me, he won't." Meanwhile, Mark was staying at a hotel, trying to figure out his next move. He'd made a mess of everything, and now his entire life was unraveling. Lauren, sensing the shift, started pulling away. Their once secret relationship, which had seemed so thrilling, now felt like a burden. She stopped answering his calls, leaving him to deal with the fallout alone. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. He started sending Emily long, apologetic texts, begging for another chance. He even showed up at the house unannounced one evening, flowers in hand. "Emily, please," he pleaded from the doorstep. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for one more chance. Let me prove to you that I can be better." Emily stared at him, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to believe him, to hold on to the life they'd built together. But then she thought of Lauren, of all the lies, and the anger surged back. "Mark, you need to leave," she said firmly. "We're done." The door closed with a finality that left Mark standing there, defeated. A few days later, Emily received a call from Joe, the private investigator. "I've got something you'll want to see," he said. They met at the same coffee shop where Joe handed her another folder. Inside were more photos, this time of Lauren meeting with someone. A man Emily didn't recognize. "That's Lauren's ex-boyfriend," Joe explained. "It seems she's been playing both sides. Mark wasn't the only one she was seeing." Emily couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction Mark had destroyed their marriage for someone who was just as deceitful as he was. But the revelation also gave her an idea. If Lauren was willing to betray Mark, maybe she'd be willing to talk. With Joe's help, Emily managed to track her down. Lauren was surprised to see Emily when she walked into the small cafe where they'd arranged to meet. "Emily," she said cautiously, her eyes darting around, "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," Emily replied, taking a seat across from her. "But we need to talk." Lauren shifted uncomfortably. "Look, if this is about Mark—" "This isn't just about Mark," Emily cut her off. "This is about the truth you've already shown you're not exactly loyal to him. So why don't we skip the games and get to the point?" Lauren hesitated, but eventually the guilt, or maybe the fear, won out. She admitted everything. How she and Mark had started their affair, how he'd promised to leave Emily, and how she'd started seeing her ex again when she realized Mark wasn't serious. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Lauren finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, standing up to leave. I hope it was worth it. As Emily walked out of the cafe, she felt a strange mix of emotions. The anger and betrayal were still there, but so was a sense of closure. Lauren's confession had confirmed what she already knew. Mark's actions had nothing to do with her. This was his failure, not hers. But Emily wasn't done yet. She had one more move to make. With Lauren's confession fresh in her mind, Emily knew she had the upper hand. She wasn't going to let Mark slink away without facing the consequences. But she also realized that this wasn't just about getting back at him. This was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her sense of control. The next morning, Emily called Claire. "It's time," she said. Claire didn't need clarification. "Do you want me to come over?" "No," Emily replied. "I need to do this alone." Later that day, Emily invited Mark over, telling him they needed to have an honest conversation. He arrived promptly, looking hopeful, as if he thought this was his chance to mend things. He carried a bouquet of her favorite flowers, peonies, and wore the same cologne he used to wear when they were first dating. But Emily wasn't swayed. "Mark," she began, her tone calm but firm, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything that's happened. I've listened to your excuses. I've seen the evidence, and I've even spoken to Lauren." At the mention of Lauren's name, Mark flinched. "You spoke to her?" "I did," Emily confirmed, folding her arms across her chest. "And you know what she told me everything." Mark's face turned pale. "Emily, I can explain—" "No," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You've done enough talking. Now it's my turn." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "For years I believed we had a partnership, a marriage built on trust and respect. But you threw all of that away. And for what a fling, a fantasy. Do you even understand the damage you've caused?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Emily held up a hand to stop him. "No, I don't want to hear your excuses. I want to hear the truth. Why, Mark? Why did you do it?" For a moment, Mark was silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I don't know. I guess I just felt stuck, like our marriage had become routine. And Lauren, she made me feel alive again." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Alive? You needed to betray me to feel alive?" "I know it sounds selfish," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I hate myself for it. But I swear, Emily, it didn't mean anything. I never stopped loving you." Emily laughed bitterly. "You keep saying that, but your actions tell a different story. Love isn't just words, Mark. It's a commitment. It's loyalty, and you broke that." The room fell silent, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the air. Emily could see the regret in Mark's eyes. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," she said finally. "We're moving forward with the divorce." Mark's head snapped up. "Emily, wait." "No," she said firmly. "This is my decision. You had your chance to fight for this marriage, and you chose someone else. Now I'm choosing me." Mark didn't argue. He nodded slowly, as if he knew there was no point in trying to change her mind. Without another word, he stood and left the house, the bouquet of peonies still sitting untouched on the coffee table. After Mark left, Emily felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't the happy ending she'd once envisioned, but it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild her life on her terms. Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into her work. Channeling her energy into her design projects, Claire was by her side every step of the way, reminding her that she was stronger than she realized. "You've been through hell," Claire said one evening as they sipped wine on the back porch. "But look at you now, you're killing it." Emily smiled, though the pain of the past few months still lingered. "It's not easy," she admitted, "but I'm learning to focus on what really matters." Then, one day, Emily received an unexpected call from Lauren. "Emily, it's Lauren," she said, her voice hesitant. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to apologize for everything." Emily was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Finally, she said, "Why now?" "Because I've had time to think," Lauren admitted, "and I realize how selfish and destructive I was. I hurt you, and I hurt Mark. I needed to say I'm sorry." Emily considered her words carefully. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, "but you need to understand that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It's going to take time for me to heal." "I understand," Lauren said quietly. "Thank you for listening." After the call, Emily felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Lauren's apology didn't erase the pain, but it gave Emily a sense of validation, a reminder that she wasn't the one at fault. As the weeks turned into months, Emily started to rebuild her life. She surrounded herself with supportive friends and threw herself into her work. She even began attending therapy, where she learned to process her emotions and let go of the anger that had consumed her. But perhaps the biggest turning point came when Emily decided to sell the house. It was a difficult decision. She'd put so much love and effort into making it their home. But she realized it was time to move on. "This house is full of memories," she told Claire as they packed up boxes. "Good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. But I need a fresh start." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "You're doing the right thing, Em. This is your chance to write a new chapter." The day Emily handed over the keys to the new owners, she felt a mix of sadness and hope. As she drove away, she realized that she wasn't just leaving a house behind. She was leaving behind the version of herself that had clung to a broken marriage. She was ready to move forward. Months passed, and while Emily was beginning to feel more like herself again, she couldn't shake the sense that the final chapter of this ordeal hadn't been written yet. The divorce proceedings with Mark had been relatively straightforward. He didn't contest the terms, perhaps out of guilt. But Emily knew Mark well enough to sense there was something simmering beneath the surface. Her suspicions were confirmed one morning when her lawyer, Karen, called with an urgent tone in her voice. "Emily, I just received a notice Mark is attempting to challenge the financial settlement," Karen said. "He's claiming that some of the marital assets were unfairly distributed." Emily felt her stomach drop. "Unfairly distributed? He cheated on me." "I know," Karen replied, her voice steady. "But he's saying that some of the evidence you provided, specifically the financial records and those hotel receipts, was obtained illegally. He's trying to use this as leverage." Emily took a deep breath, her anger bubbling to the surface. "So now he's trying to play the victim." "Essentially," Karen said. "But don't worry, we'll fight this. He doesn't have a leg to stand on." Emily hung up the phone, her mind racing. She thought she'd put all of this behind her, but now Mark was dragging her back into the chaos. She knew she couldn't let him get away with it, not after everything he'd done. The tension came to a head a week later during a court hearing. Mark sat on one side of the courtroom, his lawyer whispering in his ear, while Emily sat on the other, Karen by her side. The air was thick with hostility as both sides presented their arguments. Mark's lawyer claimed that Emily had invaded his privacy by digging into his financial records and hiring a private investigator. He painted a picture of Mark as a man who had made mistakes, but was being unfairly punished for them. Emily clenched her fists, struggling to keep her composure. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she didn't hold back. "Let's be clear," Karen began, her voice firm. "My client didn't invade Mr. Carter's privacy. She uncovered evidence of his infidelity, evidence that he tried very hard to keep hidden. If Mr. Carter didn't want his actions exposed, perhaps he shouldn't have engaged in them in the first place." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Karen's words hanging in the air. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Emily's gaze. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, it was a decisive victory for Emily. The financial settlement would remain as it was, and Mark's claims of privacy invasion were dismissed outright. As Emily walked out of the courtroom, she felt a sense of triumph. But more than that, she felt free. Mark, on the other hand, looked defeated. For the first time, Emily saw him for what he truly was, a man who had tried to manipulate and control her only to fail when faced with her strength. But the climax of this story wasn't just about the courtroom battle. It was about Emily finally confronting the emotional scars Mark had left behind. That evening, Emily returned home and sat in the living room, surrounded by the quiet stillness of her new apartment. She thought about everything she'd been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight to rebuild her life, and realized that she'd come out stronger on the other side. Claire came over later that night, armed with wine and takeout. "You were amazing today," she said, raising her glass in a toast, to freedom and fresh starts. Emily smiled, clinking her glass against Claire's, to moving forward. But just when Emily thought the drama was behind her, she received an unexpected message the next morning. It was from Lauren. "I need to talk to you," the message read. "It's important." Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to reopen that chapter, but something about the tone of the message intrigued her. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet Lauren at a nearby cafe. When Emily arrived, Lauren was already there, looking more disheveled than Emily had ever seen her. Gone was the polished, confident woman from before. In her place was someone who looked frazzled and on edge. "Thank you for meeting me," Lauren said, her voice shaky. "What is it?" Emily asked, crossing her arms. "I thought we were done." "I know," Lauren said quickly. "But there's something you need to know about Mark." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" Lauren took a deep breath. "After everything happened, I tried to move on, I really did. But Mark, he's not the man you think he is. He's been harassing me. Showing up at my workplace, calling me at all hours, saying he wants to fix things. It's gotten to the point where I've had to block his number." Emily felt a pang of unease. She knew Mark could be persistent, but this sounded extreme. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think he's losing it," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "And I think you should be careful. If he's doing this to me, who knows what he might try with you." Emily didn't know how to respond. She'd seen Mark's manipulative side before, but this was something else entirely. As she left the cafe, her mind raced with possibilities. Was Lauren exaggerating, or was there more to Mark's behavior than she realized? That night, Emily double-checked the locks on her doors and windows. She wasn't sure if Lauren's warning was justified, but she wasn't taking any chances. For the first time since moving into her new apartment, she felt a flicker of fear. But Emily wasn't about to let Mark, or anyone else, control her life. She reached out to Karen the next day, explaining the situation and asking for advice. Karen recommended filing a restraining order, just in case. As Emily sat in the lawyer's office, signing the paperwork, she felt a mix of emotions. Fear, yes, but also determination. Mark had already taken so much from her. But she wasn't going to let him take her peace of mind. The next few days were uneventful, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She started noticing little things. A car parked outside her building for longer than seemed normal. A shadowy figure lingering in the hallway. She told herself she was being paranoid, but the tension continued to build. And then, one evening, it happened. Emily was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when she heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and when she looked through the peephole, her heart sank. It was Mark. She hesitated, debating whether to open the door. But before she could make a decision, Mark spoke. "Emily, I know you're in there. Please, just let me talk to you." His voice sounded calm, almost pleading, but Emily knew better than to trust him. "Mark, you're not supposed to be here," she said through the door. "You need to leave." "Please, Emily," he begged. "Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the doorknob. She knew she should call the police, but part of her wanted to face him, to show him that he no longer had any power over her. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door a crack, just enough to look him in the eye. 5 minutes, she said firmly. "That's all you get." Mark stood in the hallway, looking disheveled and desperate. Emily could see the tension in his face, the cracks in the polished persona he'd always worn like armor. But she wasn't about to let her guard down. "You have 5 minutes," she repeated, keeping the door partially closed. Mark stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. Emily, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, but you have to understand. I didn't mean for things to get this bad. Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression cold. You didn't mean for things to get this bad. You cheated on me, lied to me, and tried to manipulate our divorce settlement. What exactly did you think would happen, Mark? He flinched at her words, his shoulders sagging. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For all of it, I've been a terrible husband, a terrible person. But I'm trying to change. I need you to give me another chance. Emily stared at him, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to believe him, to cling to the hope that the man she'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere. But then she remembered the nights she'd spent crying, the betrayal she'd endured, and the strength it had taken to rebuild her life. No, Mark, she said firmly. You don't get another chance, not after everything you've done. His expression darkened, the desperation in his eyes replaced by something colder. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice dropping. You think you're better off without me, but you don't know what it's like out there. People aren't as forgiving as I've been. Emily's stomach turned. This wasn't the man she'd married. This was someone who couldn't stand losing control. Leave, Mark, she said, her voice steady, before I call the police. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, with a bitter laugh, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Emily closed the door and locked it, her heart pounding in her chest. She leaned against the door, taking deep breaths to calm herself. This wasn't over. She could feel it. The next morning, Emily filed an official restraining order against Mark. She wasn't taking any chances. Karen assured her that they'd done everything by the book, but Emily couldn't shake the sense of unease that followed her everywhere she went. Her fears were confirmed later that week when Claire called her in a panic. Emily, have you seen Mark's latest stunt? Claire asked, her voice frantic. What are you talking about? Emily asked, her pulse quickening. Check your email, Claire said. He sent something to everyone. Emily opened her laptop, her hands trembling. There it was, an email from Mark, sent to her entire professional network. In it, he accused her of being vindictive and manipulative, claiming she'd used their divorce to ruin his life. He'd even included photos of them from happier times, painting himself as the victim of a cold, calculating woman. Emily's stomach churned as she read the email. This wasn't just a personal attack, it was an attempt to destroy her reputation. Claire's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. You need to fight back, Em. You can't let him get away with this. I know, Emily said, her jaw tightening, and I will. Over the next few days, Emily worked tirelessly to counter Mark's smear campaign. She reached out to her clients, explaining the situation and providing evidence of Mark's actions. Karen helped draft a cease and desist letter, warning Mark that any further attempts to defame her would result in legal action. But Emily knew that fighting back wasn't enough. She needed to confront Mark one final time, to put an end to his games once and for all. She arranged to meet him in a public place, a park they used to visit when they were first dating. She chose the location carefully, knowing it would be harder for him to cause a scene in front of others. Mark was already there when she arrived, sitting on a bench and looking every bit the contrite ex-husband. But Emily wasn't fooled. Why are you doing this, Mark? She asked, sitting down across from him. Haven't you caused enough damage? He looked at her, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. You took everything from me, Emily. My home, my reputation, my future. What did you expect me to do? Just roll over and accept it? I expected you to take responsibility for your actions, she shot back. But instead, you're lashing out like a child who didn't get his way. This isn't about me, Mark. It's about you. You couldn't handle losing control, so you're trying to drag me down with you. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. You think you're punishing me? Emily continued, her voice steady. But all you're doing is proving to everyone exactly who you are, and let me tell you something, you're not going to win, not this time. She stood up, her heart pounding. Stay out of my life, Mark. This is your last warning. As she walked away, she felt a surge of strength she hadn't felt in months. She'd faced him, confronted his toxicity, and walked away unscathed. But the drama didn't end there. That evening, Emily received a call from Lauren. "Emily, you need to be careful," Lauren said, her voice urgent. "Mark's been spiraling ever since the divorce. I don't think he's done." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her pulse quickening. "I mean, he's angry," Lauren said. "And when he's angry, he does stupid things. Just watch your back." Emily hung up, her unease growing. She double-checked her locks and called Claire, asking her to stay over for the night. The next morning, Emily woke to find her car vandalized. The windows were shattered and the words "liar" and "thief" were spray-painted across the hood. She felt a wave of anger and fear, but she refused to let it break her. She filed a police report and provided them with the restraining order, explaining that Mark was the likely suspect. The officers assured her they'd investigate. But Emily knew she couldn't rely on them alone. With Karen's help, Emily filed a harassment suit against Mark, escalating the legal battle to ensure he faced consequences for his actions. She also hired additional security for her apartment, determined to protect herself at all costs. The days that followed were tense, but Emily held her ground. She refused to let Mark's attempts at intimidation derail her life. And slowly but surely, things began to shift. Mark's smear campaign backfired as people began to see through his lies. Clients reached out to Emily, offering their support and reaffirming their trust in her. Even Lauren, despite her own role in the chaos, testified against Mark in court, providing evidence of his harassment. The turning point came when the judge ruled in Emily's favor, granting her additional protections and ordering Mark to pay damages for the vandalism and emotional distress he'd caused. For the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of closure. She'd stood up to Mark, faced every challenge he'd thrown at her, and come out stronger on the other side. The legal victory was a relief, but Emily knew better than to let her guard down. Mark had proven he was unpredictable, and the vandalism had only solidified her determination to protect herself. She installed security cameras around her building and made sure to keep Claire and her lawyer updated on everything. A week after the court ruling, Emily was working late in her studio when her phone buzzed. It was a notification from her newly installed security system. She opened the app, and her heart sank. A figure was standing near her apartment door, lingering just outside the camera's field of view. She couldn't make out the face, but her gut told her who it was. Without hesitation, Emily called the police. "There's someone outside my apartment," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I think it might be my ex-husband. I have a restraining order against him." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way. Emily stayed on the line, watching the figure on the security feed. The person didn't try to enter, but stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally walking away. When the police arrived, Emily showed them the footage. "It's not enough to positively identify him," one of the officers said, frowning. "But given the restraining order, we'll increase patrols in the area." Emily nodded, grateful but still uneasy. She decided to stay at Claire's place for a few days, not wanting to take any chances. The next morning, Claire confronted her over coffee. "You can't keep living like this," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Mark is trying to intimidate you, and it's working. You need to take back control." Emily sighed. "I know, but how he's like a shadow I can't escape." Claire leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "Then it's time to turn on the light, expose him for what he is." Inspired by Claire's words, Emily decided to go public with her story. She reached out to a journalist she trusted, someone who had covered stories of harassment and domestic abuse in the past. Together, they crafted a detailed account of her experiences: Mark's infidelity, his attempts to ruin her reputation, the vandalism, and the ongoing harassment. The article was published a week later, accompanied by photos and court documents that backed up every claim. Emily's story quickly gained traction, drawing support from people who had faced similar situations. Her inbox was flooded with messages from strangers thanking her for her bravery and sharing their own stories of resilience. Mark, however, was furious. He sent her a string of emails, Alternating between angry rants and desperate pleas for her to retract the article, Emily forwarded everything to Karen, who added the emails to the growing list of evidence against him. But the public attention also had an unexpected effect. Mark's employer, who had been unaware of the full extent of his actions, launched an internal investigation. Within days, Mark was fired from his high-paying job, leaving him with no income and a tarnished reputation. Emily felt a pang of guilt when she heard the news. Despite everything, she'd never intended to completely destroy his life. But Claire reminded her that Mark had brought this on himself. "He made his choices, Em," Claire said. "Now he has to live with the consequences." The final confrontation came a few weeks later. Emily was returning to her apartment after a late meeting when she saw Mark waiting for her in the lobby. Her heart raced, but she didn't let her fear show. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice steady. Mark looked exhausted, his face drawn and his clothes rumpled. "I just wanted to talk," he said. "Please, Emily, just hear me out." "You're violating the restraining order," she said, pulling out her phone. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Mark said bitterly. "I've already lost everything. What more can they take from me?" Emily hesitated, torn between anger and pity. For a moment she saw a glimpse of the man she'd once loved, the man who had promised her the world. But she knew that person was gone, replaced by someone she could no longer trust. "You did this to yourself, Mark," she said quietly. "You made the choices that brought you here, and now you have to deal with the consequences." Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Emily watched him go, a mix of relief and sadness washing over her. The next day, Emily filed an official report with the police, documenting the encounter. She was done giving Mark the benefit of the doubt. From now on, she would do whatever it took to protect herself. Over time, the tension began to fade. Mark stopped contacting her, and the patrols around her apartment kept her feeling safe. She focused on her work, her friendships, and the future she was building for herself. One evening, as Emily sat on her balcony with a glass of wine, she reflected on everything she'd been through. The pain, the betrayal, the fear. It had all shaped her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had made her stronger. Claire joined her a few minutes later, carrying a bowl of popcorn. "So," she said, settling into a chair, "what's next for Emily Carter?" Emily smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in a long time. "Whatever I want," she said. "For the first time in years, I'm free." As they sat under the stars, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. The storm was over, and she had survived. More than that, she had thrived, and as she looked toward the future, she knew that she was finally ready to let go of the past. After Mark's desperate encounter in the lobby, Emily thought the worst was finally over. But as the weeks went by, she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. There was a lingering tension, like the calm before a storm, and she knew better than to ignore her instincts. One evening, Emily was finishing up a late client meeting when her phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Call me ASAP, it's about Mark." Her stomach dropped. She stepped outside to a quiet corner and dialed Claire's number. Claire answered on the first ring, her voice filled with urgency. "Emily, you're not going to believe this Mark's been arrested." "What?" Emily's mind raced. "Arrested for what?" Claire took a deep breath. "He showed up at Lauren's workplace today. Apparently he caused a scene, yelling, demanding to see her and threatening her boss when they tried to make him leave. Someone called the cops, and he was taken into custody for harassment and trespassing." Emily exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her. "So, he's finally facing consequences." "It looks like it," Claire said. "But Emily, this could be the break you need. If the court sees this, they might extend your restraining order, or even put him under stricter supervision." Emily nodded, already mentally preparing to call her lawyer. "Thanks for telling me, Claire. I'll handle it." The next day, Emily met with Karen to discuss the implications of Mark's arrest. Karen was optimistic. "This incident shows a clear pattern of behavior," she said. With this, we can argue for more severe restrictions to ensure your safety." Emily felt a glimmer of hope. For months, she'd been living in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. Maybe this was the turning point she'd been waiting for. But Mark's actions had left more than just a legal mess. Lauren, shaken by the confrontation at her workplace, reached out to Emily. The two women met at a small cafe, their shared experiences creating an unspoken bond. "I'm sorry you've had to go through this," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "I never thought he'd go this far." Emily studied her for a moment. "You were part of the problem, Lauren, but I don't think you ever expected to end up in the middle of this nightmare." Lauren nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't. I thought I knew him, but I was wrong. He's not the man I thought he was." Emily felt a pang of empathy, despite everything. "Neither of us knew who he really was," she said softly, "but we're not going to let him control us anymore." As they talked, Emily realized that Lauren wasn't her enemy. They were both victims of Mark's manipulations, and while their relationship was complicated, they shared a common goal: to move on and rebuild their lives. The court hearing following Mark's arrest was tense but decisive. The judge extended Emily's restraining order and issued a no-contact order for Lauren as well. Mark, visibly defeated, stood silently as the verdict was read. For the first time, Emily saw him not as a threat, but as a man undone by his own choices. But the story wasn't over yet. A few days after the hearing, Emily received an unexpected call from Mark's sister, Rachel. They hadn't spoken in years, but Rachel's voice was filled with urgency. "Emily, I need to talk to you," Rachel said. "It's about Mark." Emily hesitated. "What is it?" Rachel sighed. "I've been trying to help him, but he's not listening to anyone. He's blaming everyone else for what's happened. His job, his relationships, you. I'm worried he's going to do something reckless." Emily's heart sank. She didn't want to care about Mark anymore, but Rachel's words stirred something in her. "What can I do?" she asked reluctantly. "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "I just thought you should know. Maybe this is something the court needs to handle. He's not in a good place." Emily hung up, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't fix Mark's problems, but she also couldn't ignore the warning signs. She reached out to Karen again, asking if additional steps could be taken to monitor Mark's behavior. "You've done everything right," Karen assured her. "At this point, it's up to the legal system to handle him. Focus on your own life, Emily. You've earned some peace." Emily took Karen's advice to heart. She threw herself into her work, taking on new projects and even collaborating with a nonprofit to design spaces for women rebuilding their lives after abuse. It was fulfilling work, and for the first time in months she felt like she was making a difference. But the shadows of her past weren't so easily erased. One evening, as Emily was locking up her studio, she noticed a familiar figure across the street. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Mark. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching her. But his presence was enough to send a chill down her spine. Emily didn't confront him. Instead, she went back inside and called the police, reporting the violation of her restraining order. By the time the officers arrived, Mark was gone, but Emily's fear lingered. The next morning, she met with Claire, who was furious when she heard what had happened. "This has to stop," Claire said. "He's crossing every line, and it's not okay." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not going to let him win, Claire. He doesn't get to dictate how I live my life." With Karen's help, Emily filed for a formal review of Mark's actions. The court responded swiftly, mandating that Mark attend counseling and issuing a stricter no-contact order. The legal system was finally catching up to him, and Emily felt a small sense of justice. But the real victory came when Emily realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Mark's attempts to intimidate her had lost their power. She was stronger than he was, stronger than she'd ever been. As the weeks turned into months, Emily began to reclaim her life. She moved into a new apartment with better security, expanded her business, and even started dating again. It wasn't easy, but she was determined to move forward. The final turning point came when she received a letter from Mark. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but a rambling attempt to explain his actions. He blamed his upbringing, his insecurities, and his job stress, but nowhere in the letter did he take real responsibility. Emily read the letter once, then tore it up. She didn't need closure from Mark. She'd found it within herself. Sitting on her balcony that evening, Emily reflected on everything she'd been through. The betrayal, the fear, the battles. It had all shaped her into someone stronger, someone who could face anything life threw her way. And as the city lights sparkled around her, Emily knew she was finally free. After tearing up Mark's letter, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. She didn't need his explanations or excuses. What she needed, and what she'd fought so hard to achieve, was peace. Mark no longer held power over her, and the realization filled her with a freedom she hadn't felt in years. The final chapter of Emily's story wasn't about him. It was about her. With the restraining orders in place and Mark mandated to attend counseling, Emily was finally able to focus fully on her future. She moved into a new loft in the heart of the city, a space that felt like a true reflection of her, modern, bold, and unapologetically hers. The walls were adorned with her favorite art pieces, and the open design let in endless natural light, symbolizing the clarity and openness she'd embraced in her life. Work was thriving, too. Emily's interior design business had grown exponentially, thanks in part to the support of clients who admired her resilience and strength. She'd even started mentoring younger designers, helping them navigate the industry while encouraging them to prioritize their worth and boundaries, lessons she'd learned the hard way. One of the most fulfilling parts of her journey was her collaboration with the nonprofit organization she'd partnered with earlier. Together, they created beautiful, safe spaces for women who had escaped abusive relationships, giving them a fresh start. For Emily, it was more than just work. It was a mission. Every project felt like a way to turn her pain into purpose, and it reminded her that healing wasn't just about moving forward, but also about lifting others along the way. Claire, of course, remained a constant in Emily's life. They celebrated every milestone together, whether it was a successful project launch, a new client, or just a quiet evening with wine and laughter. Claire had been Emily's rock through it all, and their friendship had only grown stronger. "You've come so far, Em," Claire said one evening as they sat on Emily's balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Emily smiled, her heart full. "I am. For the first time in a long time, I really am." As for Mark, he faded into the background of Emily's life. The counseling sessions mandated by the court helped him come to terms with his actions, but Emily never reached out to check on him. She didn't need to. She had let go of the anger and pain he'd caused, choosing instead to focus on her own happiness. Lauren, too, had moved on. The two women weren't friends, but they had found a mutual understanding and respect for one another. Lauren left her job and started over in a new city, using the experience as a catalyst for her own growth. She even reached out to Emily one last time to thank her for showing her what strength looked like. But the most significant change was in Emily herself. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to stand up for herself, and to recognize her own worth. She no longer measured her happiness by the success of her relationships. Instead, she found joy in her work, her friendships, and the life she was building. One afternoon, as Emily was finalizing plans for a new project, her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Check your email, you've been nominated for an award." Confused but intrigued, Emily opened her email to find a message from a prestigious design association she had been nominated for their annual Resilient Designer Award, recognizing professionals who had overcome adversity while contributing to the industry. The nomination was a complete surprise, but as she read the details, tears filled her eyes. It wasn't about the award itself. It was about what it represented. Her story had inspired others, not just in her personal life, but in her professional world as well. She had turned her pain into art, her heartbreak into purpose, and her struggles into strength. The night of the awards ceremony, Emily stood in front of a packed room, accepting her trophy. Her speech was short but heartfelt. "This isn't just about design," she said, her voice steady. "It's about resilience, about finding beauty in the broken places and knowing that you have the power to rebuild, stronger and brighter than ever." The audience erupted into applause, and for the first time, Emily didn't feel like she was standing in Mark's shadow. She was standing in her own light. In the days that followed, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. There were moments of darkness, yes, but also moments of profound growth and discovery. She had learned to set boundaries, to surround herself with people who uplifted her, and to embrace the person she was becoming. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sunset, Claire joined her with a bottle of champagne. "To the next chapter," Claire said, raising her glass. "To the next chapter," Emily echoed, clinking her glass with Claire's. "And to living on my own terms." As the night wore on, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain she'd endured, but for the strength it had unlocked within her. She realized that while the story of her marriage had ended, the story of her life was just beginning. And with that, Emily closed the book on Mark, on the betrayal, and on the fear that had once consumed her. She was no longer defined by the past. She was free, she was strong, and she was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible journey. If Emily's story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring tales like this one. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next video.